Sorry for the delay. I'll get you mic'd up real quick. If you want, you can put this on here, or I can help you put this on here. I recommend taking your glasses off first, and then...
Can I use my clicker?
You sure can. We have one for the room, actually.
Oh, that works.
And it was from... Once that part's comfortable in your ear, I can adjust. But is it comfortable in your ear now?
These things do fall.
A little bit, yeah. Does that feel good? So just go, because I'll adjust the rest based on it being comfortable in your ear. So, yeah. Yep.
Well, it's 11:45 to. Confusing to us because
Is it?
yes, it is. It
middle
says 11,
session.
yes, so it says 12:30, and then
Well, the
the next.
12:30 is that one. Looks like.
Okay, we. Oh,
And see, that's
this
what
starts
it.
at 1:15. Yes. So I would say I'm all the way till 1.
I think it goes to
an hour.
1. I think it goes to 1. Yeah.
Or 12:45. Between 12:45
And
to
we're
1.
like
12:45. Okay.
had a little bit of a delay here with the IT,
So
I'm I hope to start in the next. I didn't even check.
yeah, sure.
Hopefully, we can have time for questions or whatever. Where's my stuff? Oh, here it is. Hi. How are you doing?
Okay, for the sake of time, we want to kind of keep things moving along here. Welcome here. My name is Cindy Friesen, and I'll be the host for this session. And it's titled Church Planting as the New Evangelism. And before I introduce our presenter, I want you to know that this session is being live streamed on our YouTube channel. And please know that your image may appear on the live stream broadcast. If you don't absorb all the content in this session, or if you'd like to see any of the other sessions you may have missed, the video of each session will be available after Mission Fest is over on that channel. Out of respect to our speakers and other attendees, we'd ask that you turn your phones off. Our presenter today is Timothy Tennent of Beeson Divinity School. Timothy Tennent joined the faculty of Beeson Divinity School in January 2025 after serving for 15 years as the president of Asbury Theological Seminary. He previously directed the missions programs at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary from 1998 to 2009. He teaches courses in missiology, focusing on the Christian response in both Muslim and Hindu contexts. He also has served for more than 3 decades as a regular adjunct professor of missions at the Luther W. New Junior College in Dehradun. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, Dehradun?
Yeah, very good.
In India. He has published many books and articles on missions and co-authored with his wife, Julie, a metrical psalter, and now the word on here says theological journey, but I'm thinking when I looked it up, it was a meditative journey through the Psalms. He is ordained in the Global Methodist Church. Please give Timothy a warm Mission Fest welcome.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Is this on? You can't hear me. Is it on? There we go. Now you hear me too much. It's so good to see you and be with you today, and thank you for the opportunity. I thought it'd be nice to do a session on church planting, especially since I mentioned in the last session one of the gaps between evangelism and church planting has been very profound. And so one of the things that's happened in our generation, especially young people, has been kind of merging together evangelism and church planting in some very effective ways. I'm very encouraged by that. This is entitled Backward Engineering from North India to North America. And I don't know if you know this, but we worked in India for many years, and what I found that Indians would do is they would they would find out like what was America doing, and this would be Canadians or U.S., either one, in any kind of fields. And they would take it and they would reverse engineer it back to India, and they would do it for cheaper and faster. It was amazing what they could do with it. There's amazing reverse engineering. There have been whole books written on this. But I thought, well, it's the same thing we could learn from them in terms of church planting and how we could apply that to our church planting. So what I thought, I have a lot of slides here, but I'm going to go through them rather quickly. I want to just also have time for any interaction you want to have or questions at the end. So hopefully, let's take some time. If you have questions, please feel free to raise them. When I went to India, we went there, and one of our many things to do there was to help church planting in North India. If you know India, you'll know that traditionally India, the church has been dominated in two regions of the country. In the southern 4 states, now it's 5 states. They've subdivided some states. And then over in the northeast India. But in the main part of North India, which is the Ganges Plain, has largely been unreached with the gospel. And that's where most of the unreached people groups are found in North India. So we were there in North India, a place called Dehradun, for that purpose, to help to start a school there. And that school has been prospered to this day. And the school really was focused from the beginning on training people to go out and start churches. So what happened was we went out, and I'll give you some little pictures to show you kind of where we are. It's not working. Turn on. It's still not working. Is there an IT person here? There we go. Is it working? Yeah, okay. So just to give you a little feel for it, India is today the most populated country in the world. They finally surpassed China. They were really excited about that, and they are determined to continue on. It's a very populated country, and North India, where we worked, that is the population center of India. So the amount of people is just staggering in India. And I mentioned this last time. You can see the number of people there that are unreached in India. India is also the world's largest English-speaking country. So even though we worked in a part of India which is Hindi-speaking, Hindi's in the north, people, a lot of people know English. So there's more English speakers in India than there is in North America. So there's a lot of English is also there in India. Kind of a fun fact. This is like just one of many of the gatherings that happened very close to where I was teaching in India. Is a place called Haridwar, and that's where you have one of the sites for this largest human gathering in history called the Kumbh Mela. It's a big pilgrimage to this place, and you can see the crowds as far as the eye can see. It's a very, very populated part of India. It is, of course, Hinduism is there. It's the third largest religion in the world, and almost 95% of the world's Hindus live in India. So my ministry was focused mostly on communicating the gospel to Hindus. Now, this session is about what we can learn from that to North America. But I want to say up front, the issues we found in India would virtually not correspond to anything here, but that's okay. What I found was we went out into India. We were located in where it says Dehradun, extreme North India. So we're on that place in India. The Ganges River starts out at a place called Uttarkashi. It comes out and it flows out, and right near where our school was the first place the Ganges River hits the plains and becomes like a river. You can like dip in and all that. So it's a very sacred spot. In Hindu mythology, they believe there's a big fight between the gods and the demons, and there's this one little drop of stuff called amrit. It supposedly gives you eternal life. It fell and hit on that spot in India where we are. And so it's a place of pilgrimage. They believe if you go there and dip, you can release your karma and all this. So it's a very strategic place to be, very strong. The whole Hindu valley, the whole Ganges River is really, really the center of Hindu religion. and this is centered in that part of India. This is the college that eventually was built. That's me, a younger version of myself on the right. Here we are cutting up a center that we developed later. These are just some examples. These are training centers. These are the churches often meet like this outside. This is one of the early church plants in a place called Orissa, also North India. This is a baptismal service. This is like, we basically would build like things to catch water in order to have like a well, and they would use that also for baptism. Here's being baptized in the rivers. One of my students there named Lamuel Patanayak. These are just examples of like kind of the ministry unfolding in India. But what you don't realize, I have to show my wife Julie there. There's my wife Julie, grading one of the classes, and we also started quite a few schools in India to help to train young people in the gospel as well. But what happened in the early years when we were going out, we found that we had a lot of opposition and problems, and we were not able to communicate very well. This is the point I want to make. So what happened was I finally decided, let's do a survey of all our church planters. We had over 200 church planters at that point working around various parts of India, North India. And let's ask them, what is the first questions that Hindus ask you when you come into a village? When you preach the gospel, what questions are you getting from the Hindus? So I collected these over a 2-year period. And eventually, these were published in a book. I published this book. Here it is. It's called Your Questions, Our Answers. It's Hindi as well as an English version. And you can see the name there is Premraj Dharmananda. In India, if I published it under the name Timothy Tennent, it would be thrown into the trash because Hindus don't read books by people with English names. But in India, everyone's named after their gods. So North India, Hindus name their kids after their gods. And so I thought, well, okay, how can I be named after Jesus Christ? Jesus Christ is the King of love. So I go by the name Premraj. Prem is the word for love. Raj is king, the King of love. And then the last name, Dharmananda, it means someone who's a teacher. Because I'm teaching about the King of love, which is a way of saying, for me, teaching about Jesus. So they will take this. This is sold in, train stations and various places will sell this little booklet. I even actually met a Hindu man one time who said to me, hey, I found a book that was very helpful for me. I want to ask you about it. He goes into his house and comes out with this book. I didn't dare tell him that I wrote it. I said, it's a great book. Anyway, but the tragedy, this book, and we have a second volume printed later, but this book identified the 15 most asked questions that Hindus ask Christians in North India, okay? The 15 most, and I'll show you a few of them later, but it doesn't really matter, but I'm going to just give you the point of this is that, okay, once I finally had gotten through our surveys, and, the good news is, there's 800 million, Hindus, but they don't have 800 million questions. They had the same question they ask over and over and over again. So there are certain questions which are really important to Hindus, and they were questions that eventually I got so many responses where people like church parents said, yeah, they asked me that, they asked me this. So we went back and looked at our curriculum at our Bible college, the place I saw you earlier, and said, how many of these questions do we address in our curriculum? Guess how many? None. All right, so here we were with a school in North India, and we were preparing students to reach Hindus for Christ, and we were not preparing them to address any of the top 15 questions that they would actually be asked. Okay, this is the point. I'm starting to get a little reverse engineering here. Now I realized, wow, how much do we actually know about what's in the mind of unbelievers? Because we have our preparation that we go through, in Sunday school, church, schools, whatever, of like what the gospel is. We learn the Bible. We do a lot of study but on our side of the fence, but do we really understand what they are thinking, what they're asking? All right, so when I was trained in missionary work, one of my most great moments was when Andrew Walls, who's my professor, said this to me, said this to the class. He said, the greatest work of any missionary is to get inside somebody else's head. And I realized when we were in India, we were not getting inside the Hindu head, and that we weren't answering the questions that they had. And once we began to reshape our curriculum, and we were doing a training school, so it's a little different from like a church work, but still we were training future pastors. We shifted the whole thing to actually address the actual questions that Hindus actually have. And that's when we began to actually see a big change, and you see some of the church plants. Eventually, over 500 churches were planted among Hindus, and others among Sikhs and other groups, but particularly the Hindus is what I was working with. So I'll just for curiosity, because people often ask me, well, what were the questions? I'll mention a few of them just to give you examples, but they're not important for what I want to say today. They were really big on, like, why would you're asking us to reject our own national God? Their idea, a Hindu idea very strongly, is America has their gods, Canada has their God, the Western world worship Jesus. We worship Rama, we worship Krishna, we have our gods. Those are the national gods. Why would we reject our national God for your national God? They do not see gods as something that transcends like national identity. That's a big part of current Indian politics, because they believe that the whole country should be Hindu. And so this is the danger of any kind of religious nationalism. But certainly that was a big challenge. Another question was, they were really, really worried about their parents and whether or not, can I follow Christ even if my parents tell me I cannot? Okay, well, in the Western world, as you know, we have a much stronger emphasis on individual autonomy in making decisions like this. But not so in India. It's very much a family matter. And so if your parents, even if you're convinced, we had many people said to us, I really believe what you're saying is true. I believe it is true, but I can never get baptized because my parents won't permit it. Okay, it's a very strong motif, and all of our evangelism was parents and how they might respond. Again, these are questions that may not arise in a place like Canada. Did it go off? Is it good? Are you booting back up? What's that? Okay. So the whole point of this is to realize that there are other questions. I'll just mention a few of them here I had written down. Another one that was asked is, this was like number one, why do Christians not take prasad? Okay, prasad is food sacrificed to idols. So in the Indian world, in the Hindu world, this is true for much of the other parts of the world as well that have worship like this. They will go to the temple, and you'll bring food to the temple to offer to the gods. So you'll offer, there's certain things that are very often done. There's also flowers involved, coconuts and various things. And there's little cakes that they make from home. And they bring this food, these cakes, to the temple. They go into the temple and they offer them to the gods. All right, so when that happens, when it's finished, the priest may take some, but you eventually are brought this has been food sacrificed to idols, just like 1 Corinthians chapter 8. And then those are being brought back out, and then they take them into your friends, and you give that food to your friends, and they eat it. So what happens is, Christians will be at their home one night, and they'll be knocking at the door, and their Hindu neighbor will say to them, here's some food. All right, so the Christians are very divided about this. A lot of Christians say it's wrong to eat food sacrificed to idols. We will refuse to do it, and therefore they won't take it. Now the challenge with this, of course, is that if you refuse to take prasad. If you're a Hindu and you offer your neighbor this food and they refuse to take it, the message they get is, I reject your friendship. I don't want to be your friend. All right, so it has a very different connotation than what we think it means. I'm being faithful to the gospel, et cetera. And this is why in the early church it was a big fight. And Paul said you are actually free to eat. But if someone has a weaker conscience, he'll refrain from it if it causes someone to stumble. But we are free to eat. So they kind of just resolve it that way. But the point being is that these kind of questions that come up become very, very crucial for how you talk to Hindus, what they interpret by how Christians respond when we go to their homes to witness, because all the witnessing happens in homes. You really can't witness on the streets very easily in North India. So we're talking, how do you get inside someone's home? Well, if you refuse their food, they think you don't want to be their friend, and the whole thing breaks down from there. So the point is, we had not, and this is not like to discuss all these issues, but the issue of, is Jesus the only way to God? Do you eat food to idols? These are like really big issues that are important for Christians working in India. So we had to retool ourselves to think about how we proceeded in our work. So that's actually my point. By the way, these are the gods that were worshipped where we were. These are very, very famous gods in India, and this is Vishnu. Vishnu and is a Shiva. These are big, very, very well-known gods. This is Krishna. This is Rama. These are the central gods worshipped where we were in North India. So the question is, what questions people have in their heads? What would the North American vision be of your questions, our answers? Okay, this is the thing I think is finally turning the tables in places like Canada and the U.S. and Western Europe. If you look at the kind of story of unbelief, I have a chart later to show you, there's been a tremendous loss of faith among the millennial generation. So this has been tracked, going back to the 70s, the so-called nones, right, the N-O-N-Es. These are people that have rejected the faith of their parents and grandparents. This number has been growing pretty dramatically in the Western Europe and in the U.S. and Canada. So it comes down to, this is, every year is different, but roughly, if you could put Western Europe and the U.S. and Canada together and you average it out, it averages to about 24,000 people every day leaving their faith. 24,000 a day loss every single day. Because this goes on from 1970 all the way till last year, or I guess now a year and a half ago. Now, a year and a half ago is when the statistic changed. So in the U.S., I'm not sure what it is in North America, in Canada, but in the U.S., the number of people who said they followed no religion at all had gone all the way to 30 million people in the U.S. And whatever comparable, I'm sure would be probably even more so in Canada. I have a statistic of Canadian responses, but I don't know what the numbers are. So that number has grown from, like 1970, it was like about 5 to 6 million. It's grown all the way to 30 million a year and a half ago. Well, it's now at 28 million. That's still a lot of people. But what the point is, this is the first time since 1970 that the number has gone in a positive direction. Now, there's been a lot of work done on this, particularly in Britain and the UK. And in the UK, it's actually breaking faster than in the US and in Canada. So there's definitely something happening in the UK, and we'll come back to this in a little bit. But the point is, what's happening is a lot of young people are developing church planting models that are basically moving the church from the idea of, and we all know this dynamic, come to us. And that's basically been the church's motif for a long time. You come to us, we're going to have great programming, we're going to have a great worship band, we're going to have great stuff that we do, we're going to have like activities and on and on and on. And you want your church to be like a great welcoming place, which is wonderful, of course, to do all that. But the point was that was not, this is back to the problem we had in India. Despite us doing a lot of good things, it was not resulting in any significant change in the growth of that number of the nuns. So what happened is the church began to change its focus. Again, I want to give credit to young people who said, we have to bring the church to where they are, which is not easy to do. But okay, this, and of course, Canada is full of this too. So you've seen this too. It's been very prominent all across North America, where you start a church in, like a Starbucks or whatever. You're starting churches in place where they are. When I was at Asbury, we had a big church planting program there, and it was difficult to accept where some churches were being started. But I said, okay, let's let it play out. Let's just see what happens. Okay, let's just do some experiments here. And our students were saying, we want to plant a church of course, in prisons, of course, in schools, like cafeterias, okay, but also things like Starbucks, yes, but even tattoo parlors. Okay, this just hit my comfort zone. Like, I've never even been inside a tattoo parlor, but apparently that's where young people hang out. There are a lot of tattoo parlors. Also in I'm not sure your version of, do you have Lowe's, Home Depot in Canada, or some version of that? So those kind of DIY places, they have people started churches in those break rooms, for those workers, all that kind of stuff. Going to untraditional spaces and starting churches. So that's the first thing. But church, this was the other big change that was made, is that when I grew up, at church planting, we use the language of church planting. This church here, Church of the Rock, I don't know if they've done this or not, but we're going to plant a church in that part of Winnipeg. We're going to have an extension of Church of the Rock, and we will plant a church. That's happened for decades. But the new generation said, that is not working well. We need to go into what's called church multiplication. So what that means is the difference in ethos was that when we did church planting, we just planted a church, and sometimes we bought buildings, bought land, and all this stuff. They didn't do that. They started new communities of faith, and they said they planted them with the DNA from the get-go. They would be planting a new church themselves. So it created what's now called church multiplication, where you plant, church A plants church B and C, but they're planting D and E and F and G, off the get-go. And so you have a lot of multiplication through how church planting unfolds. And churches were being planted with the DNA that this is not an end. So the problem is you can't get a church movement happening unless you get a lot of churches being planted. And of course, there's a ton of problems with all this. There's all kinds of issues. And we could go into a lot of some of the issues and problems with this. But the basic idea was correct in the sense that you had to have churches that saw themselves as church planting, not simply as receiving from a mother church. That was the first phase. So you had the movement of going to where they are. You had the movement of churches getting to more church multiplication than just church planting. But then the third move is often called kingdom expressions, where they would say, okay, let's consider planting things other than churches that could make a real difference in the kingdom. So again, when we're in India, this is back to the reverse engineering. We learned in India that there were districts of India that would not allow traditional church planters in it. Okay, so we couldn't send church planters there's a whole region it was actually a 12-district region in North India with no churches in it at all, and no Christians were allowed to go there as church planters. So what do you do? So we said, again, this is reverse engineering. They said, okay, well, what do they value? Well, Indians value education above all else. There's one thing about Indian families, they're super committed to the education of their children. So we realized the schools in this region were pretty weak, and we could actually produce and start some great schools there. So we said, we're going to start schools there. And these schools are schools that have all the standard curriculum of any school, but also they have Christian education. They sing Christian songs and part of the schooling as well. But they're okay with that as long as you can prove that you're making certain scores on these examinations that they take, especially 10th grade examinations. So we did that. We now have 12 of those schools across North India. And these are schools with hundreds of kids. These are not small schools. These are big schools. Now, the point is, the parents of those children would never, ever allow us to go there as church planters. But we're now training their children. These kids are growing up. Someday, they will be the leaders in these villages, and they will let us in. Okay, that's a long, multi-generational strategy, but we're saying we have to create soil that makes it possible. So in places like Canada, where you've had so much burned over soil in terms of the gospel and so much the rise of a lot of opposition to the gospel, we often think, well, gosh, they're not responding to the gospel. Well, okay, what will they respond to? What kind of ministries can we do? And again, the booths out here are full of these things, people who've understood that. So you can see we would plant orphanages, and we'd plant schools, all kinds of things like that, sewing centers, a lot of things that would just kind of be an easy entry to help empower people and help them. And this has been done very, very effectively in these days. The UK has developed a thing called Messy Church. There's 4,000 of these in the UK. And this is, I don't know what it's like in Canada, but we lived in Scotland for 3 years. And we found that compared to at least our experience in the US, children were completely unwelcome in churches in the UK. It was not easy to bring children to church with you, like small children that were restless, because they didn't really have a Sunday school program kind of thing. They didn't have like good all the stuff, the kind of support stuff that we have. And certainly children were not in the sanctuary. That was all done, that was adults. And they would have, every so often, they would have a service. They would call it the family service. Was it once a month, every twice a month, or once every other month? They would have a service called family service. That meant you could bring your kids there. And what it basically meant was that the sermon was reduced to like a children's sermon. And so the sermon would be like really short, like 7 minutes max, because kids were restless. But the point, what it revealed was that the church environment didn't really know how to deal with families, children, all of that. Well, that's a big problem if you want to grow the church. So Messy Church, which has its challenges, I understand all that, but still, the idea behind it was revolutionary for the UK, because what it did was we want to create an environment where someone could actually bring their kids to church with them. Okay, these are things that you wouldn't think of, because it wasn't a matter of their messaging. It was a matter of just kind of creating the environment necessary in order to be supportive of the church. So they create new settings, and they move in the middle for people to come to church going to the people. This is what we already talked about, and how we focus on that. And then the other thing that I think has been remarkable in more recent decades has been what has been called the remissionizing. So a guy named Kevin, his name is Winfield Bevins. Winfield Bevins, we're going to do research on what makes churches healthy, okay? What he discovered was that most churches in North America did not know if they were healthy or sick or otherwise. They don't know. They didn't know why. These are churches extremely welcoming to people. They'd be delighted if someone came to their church. They didn't know why their church wasn't growing, maybe even declining. They didn't know why. So he developed a way of doing assessment where you determine exactly what it is that makes your church, healthy or not. What are okay, there's 12 things, and you're great on 8 of them, but these 4 over here are a real problem for you, or whatever it is. So they began to help churches understand what was it that was keeping them from being a place where you could go. So again, back to India, there are certain things about the way churches are done in India which people found very offensive and difficult, and we had to figure out how to connect the church to where they are. So for example, in the missionary movement in India, they were taught certain kinds of songs that were basically, it was like 19th century hymns that were put into Hindi, and so there became a church culture of basically singing Western hymns in church. So that's what you did in church. There was a real resistance to singing songs that were connected to the Indian tradition and how they're kind of what sounds like worship to them or songs to them, whatever. So there's a lot of work to be done on how do you understand how to make a church that people can relate to and understand. So this is all happening as well in these fresh expressions of the church and trying to involve opportunity for people to talk, have conversations. A lot of churches in the West are designed so you come into church, you're in a pew or chair, and there's no interaction between the pastor and the people. So people feel passive. They have unanswered questions, and it is a bit vulnerable to have a sermon. You say, okay, I'm going to give a 20-minute sermon, and then we have a 20-minute time for Q&A. Let's talk about my sermon. What do you think about it? What questions do you have? It's a bit vulnerable. But it creates a new kind of feeling about the church and a sense of like this is part of it. This is why the UK has been very helpful at establishing the whole Alpha course. Do you have the Alpha course? I'm sure maybe you have up here. Very effective. Because it involves, a meal, and if you use the videos, you can do it in person or do the videos. But people love watching videos; they're very well done. It's run a meal. It's in someone's home, and the whole thing is done in a way that's very comfortable. And the whole thing is based on you can ask any question you want. There's no question off the table. Well, this creates a more of an acceptance. You don't feel like you have to. You walk into a church, maybe I'm sitting in someone's pew or I may say the wrong thing. Here you're like, you can ask any question you want. It opens up channels that have been very, very effective. And these are things that have made a real difference in how churches are formed. So what they would do is they would go into churches, and churches that were basically, I don't want to use the word dead, but they were basically stagnant is the word, I think. They would be stagnant. These churches can be remissionized. That's what they're discovering. They're discovering that churches that have a long history of decline or stagnation can in fact be remissionized. In fact, they can be very, very good, vibrant churches if they're remissionized. So for example, there's a church in the U.S. It was up in, it was a well-known city, Grand Rapids, U.S., and this church had been an immigrant church, and the church had basically withered down. It probably at one point had probably 200 or 300 people, and it had gone down to probably 30. Mostly elderly people, and they love the Lord. They know why their church wouldn't grow. Well, what happened over the years, their community had dramatically changed. Their community had become much more ethnically diverse, which of course has been the story of Winnipeg, been the story of all big cities in North America are dramatically more diverse than they used to be. So churches didn't know what to do. How do we now live in a place like Winnipeg, which is completely changed? How do we relate to various ethnic groups that have moved in? How do we connect with them? So this church began, first of all, they changed their name. There was a Baptist church, but it could have been any denomination. They changed their name to, it's now called GRIF, Grand Rapids International Fellowship. And they began to have intentional ministries to help people, with immigration issues, help people with like they had language, ESL, language learning program. They did a lot of stuff to kind of connect with the community. And next thing you know, people were coming to their church. It was hard to grow again, but the church went through a transformation. If you went there today, it's like it probably is the most ethnically diverse church in Grand Rapids. Now, Grand Rapids is a pretty monolithic place compared to some cities in the U.S., but for Grand Rapids, it's an extremely diverse church. So the point is they learned to adapt and make changes, and that church got remissionized. There's something called dead alive churches, something called turnaround churches. There's different terms for that. I think I like the idea of remissionizing, or something's called replanting. So you're planting a church that already is in existence, but you basically regenerate and energize the whole thing. We won't look at all of these, but some of these things have been very helpful. Like, for example, missional communities where you see yourself. We had this problem with pastors, where pastors traditionally were sent. And by the way, all these slides will be available on the website. You don't have to copy them down. But if you go to, like, when I was a pastor, I was taught, sometimes explicitly, but certainly implicitly, that I was being assigned to a church, right? You're now the pastor of the whatever Methodist church, Baptist church, whatever, and you're the pastor of that church, which sends you the message that you're the pastor of these, 50 people or whatever it is. All right, the change in mentality to say, no, we are going to reconceptualize the church as being a minister. The mission is the people in that community. Okay, now this is again another one of these kind of changes that's made, because if you're a Hindu, if you're a Christian going into a Hindu village, there are no churches there. You have to relate yourself to the Hindus in that village to start a church. Why don't we do the same thing in a place like Winnipeg? Why don't we realize, well, there's communities. We live in a very Christian part of the U.S., but in our little street where we live, there's very few Christians on that street. There's two doors down is a wonderful family of Christians, but everybody here, you live in communities where there are not a lot of non-Christians. How do you connect with them? How do you build relationships with them? These are things that happen when you see yourself as a missional community. A lot of these churches, these cell churches where you actually start. These are the ones that start in places like tattoo parlors or Home Depot break rooms. These are not actually churches so much as cells. You get something started. It's like starting a fire. And eventually that group will be brought into a more conventional church usually. But it's a way of getting started and building some community. Because it's very hard for an unbeliever just to walk through the doors of a church. But if a church goes out to them, they meet other people like them. And I actually told Nikki Gumbel once, who is the one that led Alpha for so many years, I said, in our experience with Alpha, the first round of Alpha, or the first 2 rounds of Alpha, are extremely difficult. Because Christians often don't know unbelievers. They say within a couple of years, all your friendships become Christians. And so it's hard if you tell a typical Christian, well, go invite your unsaved friends. Well, who are they? I don't have that many unsaved friends. But unbelievers, that's all they do have. They have a ton of unsaved friends. And so once you begin to connect with unbelievers, then it begins to grow and develop, and they bring in people that you can't even imagine. Okay, this is a map of Canada's situation, and you can see, if I can point this out, you can see the numbers. By the way, this is, of course, looking at Canada in pure numbers, not percentage of Christians, which make the whole thing be much, much more alarming. But even in sheer numbers, you can see the decline. The blue bar is the Christians in Canada, and the dramatic growth of non-religious in Canada. This would be Muslim groups here, other religions, and then this would be like Eastern Hinduism, Buddhism, etc. So you have quite a few, compared to what you've had, a very dramatic growth of Muslim and Eastern religious people in places like Winnipeg. But also, this is the most really surprising as how fast that's grown. So you actually have a largely unbelieving communities all over Canada that may not have any knowledge of the gospel at all. And so it's very, very difficult for churches to and this is what I love about learning from India, because when a young Indian person, a Christian, thinks about their world in North India, they assume that their communities have never heard the gospel, have no meaningful knowledge of who Jesus Christ is, and certainly have no knowledge of how to come to faith or be saved from their sins. They assume that. Nobody knows that. Whereas we, from a long Christian heritage, assume, oh, people must surely know. No, they don't know. They don't know. And increasingly, this is showing that Canadians don't know, despite how many Christians you have here. So let me just move forward a little bit and show you another. This gives you a little feel for what's happening globally in church planting. You can see that especially in Asia and Africa, and this is different regions that separate different parts of Asia, Africa, etc. But you can see that the church planting movement globally is very, very strong in Asia and Africa. What that means is a lot of new Christians are being incorporated in the church. It's, again, averaging, this is, roughly speaking, but in Africa alone, the top one there, it's about 16,000 people per day. But China is now passing Africa in terms of, like, if you take how many people in China per day are coming to Christ, is now surpassing what had once been the engine of church growth globally, which was Africa. So it's now, like, if you said, where is the center of Christian growth happening? It's in Asia. It's in Africa, more so than North America. All right, these are big changes. So, for example, if you went back 50 years, or maybe say 100 years, maybe the average Christian might be a 47-year-old British male person. Today it's definitely younger, a 27-year-old or 25-year-old Nigerian woman. So the church has become much more ethnically diverse, much more likely to be normatively found in Africa or Asia, and more women than men. So there's more female Christians than male Christians globally in the world. These are big changes and shifts that happened since 1970. So this gives you a feel for kind of what's happening globally, but even in the Americas, this is where we are, of course, you can see some significant progress in church planting there. Let me show you this map here. This is an interesting dynamic. This shows you the growth of denominations. Now, so we talk about churches being planted, like if a Baptist church plants another church as part of the Baptist church, or Mennonites, or Lutherans, or whatever. But the other thing that's happening is entirely new Christian movements being started. Okay? So if you think about the history of the church, time of Christ until the time of the turn of the 19th century, there were only 500 denominations in the entire world. It's hard to fully, understand the impact of that. Because as you look, like, for example, if you were in Germany, well, you were a German, therefore you're a Lutheran. End of story. If you're in Spain, you're a Roman Catholic, whatever. There was very much the idea that your country, if you belonged to a country, then that you had a certain religion. That was part of the European idea of church and state. And so what happened was, once that broke down, you had multiple denominations coming up, and then eventually it began to spiral almost out of control. So by the turn of the 20th century, it's gone from 500 to almost 2,000 denominations. And then look at since 1970, 13,000, 31,000, 40,000, 44,000, 50,000. It's now over 51,000 denominations. So what's happening, if you think about this, in the first 1,800 years, it took 500 denominations in 1,800 years. Today, there are 1,000 new denominations every year in the world that come up. 1,000 new denominations every year. I belong to the Global Methodist Church. It was started like 3 years ago. I mean, it's unbelievable. The student I teach at Beeson, I'll ask them, hey, how many of you, what church do you belong to? How old is your denomination? Many of them are 2 or 3 years old, 4 or 5 years old, 10 years old. It's unbelievable. So we are seeing a massive proliferation of different denominations, which has accentuated Christians focused on how we are different. Well, how is your church doing that church? They're like, there's 10 churches on this street. How are they all different? That really has hindered the Christian witness and people knowing what is the gospel that we all share that brings us together. And that becomes increasingly difficult in a world where every single day new denominations are being formed. So on the one hand, there's been a positive growth of churches being planted. But on the other hand, it is also, and this is not all bad, but it has produced a lot of new denominations. So in India, when the colonial period was over, the colonial churches were all kind of put together into one mega denomination called the Church of North India, the Church of South India. But then after that, it was just like, no holds barred. Every time I turn around, there's a new denomination starting in India. This is true in the Philippines. It's true. We were down in the Philippines a while back, and some of the fastest growing churches in the Philippines are part of relatively new movements, like the Victory Church, for example. Those kind of church movements are new denominations that are now spreading on the world. And then what happens through global immigration, which is, by the way, dramatically increased in our lifetime, since the 60s especially. We have more people today living in a country other than their birth than at any time in the history of the world, both by numbers and by percentage, both. So it's dramatic. So the result is that the people are bringing their denominational groups with them, and they're planting churches there. So like, for example, the fastest growing church plants in the UK are not by like traditional British people, but by African immigrants into the UK. And so there's a growth. In fact, the largest churches in Europe are now immigrant churches. So this is part of fueling all of this explosion of denominations. So we live in one of the most tumultuous time of both new ways of thinking about evangelism, because I think in the way we were raised, especially if you look at the history of evangelism in North America, it was largely around things that would involve individual response, right? So you would have everything from a D.L. Moody, crusade type thing where you call people to come forward, or a tract you give somebody, evangelism explosion, all of those things which are wonderful. That's very different from forming communities and bringing people together into groups that experience Christ together. And so church planting has changed that a lot. Now, people, of course, still have to individually respond to Christ, but they're doing it in the context of communities. And we're seeing now movements of young people, especially, to Christ in ways that are catching the attention of the secular media. So you're seeing, for example, especially in the UK, a lot of reports from BBC, what's happening, all these young people filling up the churches in the UK, which before were on the verge of being empty, is starting to happen and then spreading across to North America. So these are some initial thoughts about things that were learned on the mission field and that are now being brought back to North America, basically trying to reconceptualize North America as an emerging mission field. So if like the rule of thumb is in missions, like if a country or people group is less than 5% Christian, that's considered an unreached people group. It's one of the measurement tools, okay? So the question, okay, well, gosh, obviously North America, Canada has a lot more than 5%, but if you look at demographics of young people, you can look at like Gen Z, for example, where you have big sectors of Canada where the Gen Z group is 5% or less. Again, I think Manitoba is different, I think more Christians in this province than others, but it depends on where you are in Canada. But the point is that there are real differences if you look generationally, how many people follow Christ in a different generation. So if you look at how many Christians are in Canada or in the U.S., the deeper question is, well, what are the ages of those Christians? Because the real point is, if the ages of the Christians are really fairly high, then what you have is an emerging, almost like an unreached people group, basically. So what's happened is, regardless of the percentages, the point is that the missionary movement has helped people to think about how to think about the Western world as an emerging mission field and how to address the gospel to people as if we were in North India. And we're learning lessons that are being very, very effective, more effective, in how to share the gospel and plant churches in North America. Okay, what I want to do now is just stop, because I've said a lot. Let's take a moment and take a little time for any questions or thoughts, because we have time. We have like 15 minutes for questions, maybe 20 minutes. If you have any question, and I'll repeat it, because I think it's being taped. So if you ask a question, I'll repeat it so that it can be heard on the video, or any comment you'd like to make. Who would like to ask a question? Yes.
Comment on parachurch organizations in North America, their interaction with the church. Any way that the changes in culture, Gen Z, might change the relationship between, traditional parachurch mission sending organizations and the local church? Have you seen any numbers of changes that we need to be aware of there?
Well, yeah, the question has to do with the relationship of churches to parachurches. And one of the ironies about this is that the church is a structure which requires the church to do everything Christ commanded us to do, which, of course, that's what we're supposed to do. So the church can't choose to focus on a particular thing because the church has to do everything that Christ commanded. So the parachurch is a sodality structure, and it allows people to focus on a particular thing. I mean, the obvious example is Bible translation. Okay, there's no way this church can really meaningfully translate the Bible into other languages. But Wycliffe raised her hand and says, "Well, we'll do that, but we'll do nothing else but that." That's our focus point. So I think historically the church has had a bit of a troubled relationship with parachurches because they felt like, well, gosh, how do we relate to them? They're not the church, what's what they do. But I think we're realizing the extremely important role that these ministries have in coming alongside the church and helping the church in various ways. Whether it's improving or not compared to 30 years ago, I don't know. I think it's been a matter of kind of ongoing conversations about how we relate to these groups. Because I think some churches resent these groups. And some of these other groups, to be fair, they like take over and start pretending they're the church. And so, it's a conversation you have to have because these are really meant to serve the church. The same thing for a seminary. I teach in a seminary, but I always tell our students all the time, we're not the church. We're here to serve the church. And some seminaries can forget that we serve the church. So this is an ongoing thing. I don't know. I do think that the young people today, if anything I would say it's happened, is that we didn't chart it on the chart, but there's also a growth in these sodality, these parachurches, because young people today have a lot of disillusionment with the church structure. And they feel like the church is not getting it, not understanding where their generation's thinking about, and therefore they're starting organizations outside of the church in order to reach people. But at the end of the day, Jesus said, "I will build my church." He didn't say, "I'm going to build my parachurch." So anyone who comes to Christ needs to be brought into the fellowship of a church. And so that becomes the challenge in that. It's a good question. Yes?
We have a lot of young Indian immigrants working in the malls, and that's where I work as evangelizing. And a few of them have come to Christ, but how do you suggest, as different from in India, to get these young Indian kids, especially girls around 20 years old, to faith and then to disciple them?
Yeah, it's hard to say for sure because the Indian youth that would come to Canada may fall into multiple different categories. They could be just secularized young people that come from an urban like Mumbai or somewhere in India, and they might not be significantly different than any young person that's 20 years old. That being said, it could be they may be devout Hindus for all I know. You don't know. It could be Muslims. It could be Buddhist, whatever. You don't know. But I do think that it's important to develop relationships and get to know them, understand what is their worldview, and I think Indians especially would probably, as a general rule, the main stumbling block in all of India is the idea that Christ is unique, the uniqueness of Christ. It's important to keep the focus on the unique power of Jesus Christ. Because ultimately, Christ alone is what changed people's lives. I also find that people really appreciate it. Americans, North Americans in general, all of us, we tend to be much more reticent about prayer. But much of the world, if you tell somebody they have a problem, well, let me pray for that. Let me pray for that. It's very meaningful to have someone. How can you be upset with someone praying for you? Especially Muslims are very taught from childhood to value prayer. but they're not used to prayer like the way we pray. Personal, direct prayers. They're used to more rote prayers. So there's a lot of things like that you can do to help connect with people and that you really care about them. And of course, right now, Canada's different than the U.S., but right now in the U.S., and by the way, I just want to formally apologize to all of you for all the terrible things that have happened toward Canada, because you don't deserve it. You're wonderful. The vast majority of Americans, we love Canadians. But anyway, Trump is doing what Trump does. But anyway, I do think that in America, there's such a fear in the immigrant population going right now. Just on the way here, we stopped. We were having a conversation with this lady that works in the airport, and my wife said, just very, she was clearly an immigrant. Where are you from? What we would say to anybody. And I'm afraid to answer. And afraid I might be an ICE agent or something, And no, we just want to know. I'm from Costa Rica, But it was just like there's a lot of fear. And so I don't know if that's true here, but you definitely want to find ways to dispel that fear and to build relationships. We invited the man that pumped our gas in our car, Massachusetts, much longer than other parts. They wouldn't let you pump your own gas in Massachusetts. It was weird. You had to have somebody pump it, all right? So this guy comes out, he pumps the gas. He's a Muslim guy. And so at one point, we invited him over to our house for a meal. He'd been in the U.S. for like 25, 30 years. So I went to pick him up. This is a guy that, just in dirty, like we call monkey suits. I don't know what you call it here, but just, dirty suits for pumping gas and working on cars. And he I go pick him up at his place, his apartment, and he comes out, and he's got his tie on and a coat and everything else. He's like all dressed up. Picked him up, and so he told us that night, he'd been in America for 20 years, 25 years, whatever it was, had never, ever entered an American home. If you look at the number of international students that come to Canada, it's overwhelming. Canada has an even higher percentage, not numbers, we have a higher number, but higher percentage of international students than we have. And I know you've been trying to work on it and have issues to curb it in more recent years, but you have a very high international student population. And 90% of the students will come here, leave, and never enter into a Canadian home. And so it's just a huge opportunity to connect with people. And it means a lot to them to be invited to your home. Other questions, comments? Yes.
You talked about remissioning. You talked about remissioning, especially within traditional church contexts. What strategies have you seen most successful for a traditional church to remission?
The question has to do with remissioning. It's not so much a strategy, it's actually looking at what they did. And by the way, on the Asbury website, there's a church planning tab, and you can actually look at the assessment guide. You can or have your church given to, but actually, I think it's probably called, it's 12 areas that they examine in your church, and a different strategy for each area. So it's like 12 strategies based on what your church is weak in. So some churches just have things they never thought about because they're just in their church. They don't realize how this is understood or how it's interpreted. And so based on that, it's a way of just having a church. The basic strategy is helping a church to rethink themselves as if they're a missional community rather than just a church where people gather that everybody knows each other. That's the basic strategy, and there's just different ways that's applied to the situation. Yes, over here. We have time for a few more questions. All the way over in the white shirt.
You mentioned the idea of churches at a coffee shop or Home Depot. I'm just curious what that would look like.
The question is about how does it look to have churches that meet in coffee shops or Home Depot break rooms, whatever, or a tattoo parlor. Basically, again, another thing that's been discovered is the breaking out of the Sunday morning. Church has to happen Sunday morning. So a lot of these churches, these cell group gatherings happen outside of Sunday morning. They often happen like Sunday afternoon or evenings, whatever. So people will meet, they'll agree, like we'll say we're all going to meet at this back booth, it's at 6 o'clock, whatever, and they'll have some tables they put together in the back of a Starbucks or whatever, or in a Home Depot break room. People that come to Christ in the Home Depot have breaks. And so they come and they will have prayer together. They'll share prayer requests. They'll have things they do together. So some of these are much more traditional churches in the sense that they might have, worship time, some worship, and somebody sharing the Bible. Where other times it's not that. It's much more helping people to answer questions, explaining the gospel to people. One of the problems with the NIV translation is that it takes about 7 different words and translates them all as if it's proclaim. And so you have the idea the only way to share the gospel is like in a formal setting like this, rather than sharing, telling, a lot of ways the gospel can be communicated. So these little cells happen a lot of different ways based on what the setting is and how free they are to operate. Sometimes you have Christian owners of these places that want it. Sometimes you actually rent space out. It's very common to have it to rent a space. So a lot of restaurants have rooms you can rent out for gatherings, birthday parties, whatever. They rent that out and they have their church. And one of the big other changes that's happened is that we all grew up in a church planting world where every church said someday we want our own building and land, right? That every church plant eventually must culminate in that. This whole group is saying, no, we don't want to ever do that. We don't want to someday, quote, grow up and have a building. We want to keep in the cell model, and so they keep on multiplying that way. And again, back in India, we found in these extremely sensitive areas of North India, we would have 10 people in this village and 10 in this village and 10 in that village. We'd bring them together into a group of 100, and the Hindus would riot and burn the building down, and we would have endless problems because they were really upset by 100 people gathering. But if we had 10 here, 10 there, 10 there, 10 there, no one even noticed it. And so it created a lot more ability to move into neighborhoods and penetrate in places. This is the power of Alpha, is when Alpha's over, you can say, we're going to still meet in our home. We're meeting on Friday night. We're going to do this. And next time you have a house church. These kind of things happen kind of organically, and they're done different ways. Okay, one last question. Yes?
Thank you very much for the talk. So my question still goes back to, I call it kind of a mobile church, like taking church to those who will not naturally want to come to church. So myself and a group of friends, we started doing that in Winnipeg. We started last year. So we target the People on Main Street project. Once in a week, we go there to share the word of God and share food and sing. But one major challenge that we have seen that I would like to ask, what strategy to address that is, it's very hard to raise disciples.
Hard to do what?
To raise disciples.
Oh, right.
So because of the set of people we meet, this week we might meet some people, the following week we meet different type of people entirely. And then probably we have some people that we are even seeing. We have a situation of somebody that said, okay, they want to get off, stop using drugs, but then it's very difficult for us to get them to rehabilitation, the influence of people around them. By the time we get there, the following week, so many things have changed. So how do we really raise disciples in that, taking church to them? We cannot really invite them, to church. So we've tried that, to invite them to church. Many of them don't have phone numbers. There's no address. So it's very difficult to bring them to church. And then we always go take church to them. So, but then it's very difficult to raise disciples among the folks. So what is going to be the best strategy to actually raise disciples?
It's a great question. In fact, it may be one of the most significant questions asked because it's just the point I made earlier in the first session. This is that great gap we've talked about between evangelism and discipleship, between baptism and church planting. First of all, absolutely true. It's a real challenge to disciple Christians into mature faith. And I think the problem is we have kind of abandoned the way the church always did it. The church if you look at the church's discipleship plan, as it were, it's like one of the things that shocks you in church history. It's like one of the few things the church actually agreed on. This is an example where we don't have a lot of variety, even across Roman Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant movements, but certainly in Protestant movements, the church basically said, You need to focus on three things. And if you don't do all three of these, you'll have a problem. And these three things are mirrored by the Ten Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, and the Apostles' Creed. So if you look at the history of the church almost invariably uses those three things: the Ten Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, and the Apostles' Creed. Okay, what is that about? Apostles' Creed represents the doctrinal leg of the whole thing. People need to learn what Christians believe about specific things. And the Apostles' Creed summarizes that easily, simply in 12 statements. Anybody can understand that. The prayer, and this is also some failed, is about the practice of the Christian life. What does it mean to help someone grow in things like prayer and Bible reading and all of those kind of things that we do to help us to grow? Because at the end of the day, people have to become self-feeders. They have to be able to grow themselves, read the Bible, pray, etc., and help. They need to be given the tools to do that. And then, of course, the Ten Commandments is the ethical guidelines of the church. And the church, even though we believe that we are saved by grace through faith, we do not believe that therefore we're free from ethical boundaries. In fact, Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount makes it clear that the gospel goes deeper into all of those things. Don't murder, don't be angry, don't commit adultery, don't lust. The gospel goes deeper than the Ten Commandments. So the Ten Commandments is a good starting point to introduce people into ethical requirements. And a lot of people assume that because someone's a Christian, all that immediately happens. Well, none of that will happen. So whoever's leading this group has to be very, very clear about intentionally introducing people into all three of those sectors, both doctrinal, practice, and ethical life, all three of those. And the church generally fails when we don't do that. And by the way, Alpha, one of the problems with Alpha, not problem, it's just what Alpha is. People assume that Alpha is a discipleship program. It is not. They say repeatedly in the literature, we are not that. We are simply trying to answer problems that secular people have. And the Alpha course has been, whether you like it or not, just statistically, has been the most successful tool for reaching post-Christian people in the Western world ever used. So you got to take it seriously. But it is not a discipleship thing. So it doesn't really tell you what to do when someone comes to Christ. And so at that point, the church has really struggled because there's a lot of material out there. I have a book I put out on this that kind of leads people, churches use it and has questions and answers and all that. But every denomination has something like this. But if you look in the history of your denomination, I guarantee you, your denomination, if you go back far enough, will have had a kind of set understanding of what do you do when someone becomes a Christian and how to disciple them, and now they probably don't. And a lot of it's because we've lowered the bar, just come forward, come to Christ, there's no expectations. And what the Gen Z are telling us when we ask them about the church, they don't like that. They want to be challenged. They want the church to tell them, this is what it means to be a Christian. They don't like the low bar stuff. This has been a big fallacy. And so discipleship is a real opportunity for us to take that next step and close that gap. We've been very patient, and thank you so much for the time together to think about church planting. It's a great, great thing that God's doing, and may the Lord bless all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There's been challenged for any of us there, whether or not we're going somewhere or just even in our work field. There's so much rethinking, actually, we need to do. So thank you for that, and thank you all for coming. Our next session actually starts at 1:15 in here with Jason Mandrick. And so you're welcome to come back for that. But again, thank you for coming. They wanted me to mention that there is a prayer room if anybody would like to have a time of prayer that is available to you as well. Thanks so much for coming.
Your guitar's not coming through.